Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I'm speaking with my friend Jim Finley. This is a project of www.beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and regular Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus, practicing nonviolence, and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So let's begin as usual with a little prayer. So I just invite everyone, wherever you are, just to take a deep breath and to relax and to recenter yourself. And together let's enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely and personally and everyone everywhere too. And we welcome the risen nonviolent Jesus with us and just take a moment to ask for whatever grace you need to follow the nonviolent Jesus more faithfully and to do God's will. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life, love, and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect together on your call to follow the nonviolent Jesus in peace and work for a more just, more nonviolent world. Bless us, inspire us, disarm us, heal us, strengthen us, and send us out to do your will, to do our part to help end poverty, racism, war, injustice, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, that we might be your beatitude people, your holy peacemakers, your gospel people who welcome your reign of universal love, nonviolence, and peace on earth. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, friends, it's a great blessing to welcome my friend Jim Finley, the revered teacher of contemplation and mysticism. As listeners probably know, when Jim was a teenager, he entered the Abbey of Gethsemani in Kentucky and was a novice and friend then of Thomas Merton. Eventually, he left the monastery, became a clinical psychologist, and opened his practice in Los Angeles, where he still lives today. He wrote, in my opinion, the first serious book about Merton's spirituality, called Merton's Palace of Nowhere. He has taught and lectured on Merton, spirituality, and mysticism for over 50 years, while also engaging in his practice. And these days, he's a faculty member of Father Richard Rohr's Living School at the Center for Action and Contemplation, where he hosts a free, wildly popular podcast called Turning to the Mystics, which I urge everyone to listen to. Jim is the author of several other bestsellers, such as The Awakening Call, The Contemplative Heart, and his recent memoir, The Healing Path. This year, Orbis Books is launching a massive, I think, 10-volume series by Jim on the mystics, such as Teresa of Lisieux, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and Meister Eckhart. And the first volume comes out in a few months on Thomas Merton. Jim did 2 wonderful Zoom presentations for the Beatitude Center, which you can go and listen to, as tens of thousands of others have, at our free Beatitude Center YouTube channel. I think you just sign in and write in Beatitude Center channel, and it asks for your email, but it's all free. So I hope you'll listen to his previous Beatitude Center talks. Jim Finley, welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast.
Thank you. So glad to be together again and share these reflections with the listeners.
Jim, I know everybody has asked you about this, and you've talked a lot about it, but just to at the beginning, especially with your new book coming out, if you just tell a little bit, however you want, about your story as a teenager entering the Abbey of Gethsemani and then meeting Merton and having him as a novice master and learning about God from him at such a young age. And he set you off on a course that helps so many people.
Yes. Yeah, my father's a violent alcoholic, so there's a lot of trauma in my home. And my mother was a devout Catholic, and she would take us to Mass on Sunday. And I could tell her faith sustained her. And I think it was through her, really, I think my faith sustained me. And when I was in a 9th grade religion class at the Catholic school I was going to in Akron, Ohio, the instructor mentioned monasteries and talked about Thomas Merton. I never heard of Thomas Merton about monasteries. And I was so taken by what he was saying I went that day to the school library. They had one book there by Merton, The Sign of Jonas, which is a journal he kept in the monastery. And on the very first page of that journal, Merton says, "As for me, I have but one desire, the desire for solitude, to disappear into the secret of God's face." And at 14 years old, I didn't know what it meant. But the depth in which he spoke of his own longing for God accessed that longing in me. And I got my own copy. And through the 4 years of high school, that book sustained me in the trauma to the point that when I graduated, I went to the monastery and lived there as a monk for 6 years. It had a profound effect on me. And Thomas Merton, in his role of master of novices, guided me in the contemplative life and in the classical texts of the mystics. And it just radicalized me. It just had a profound, lasting effect on my whole life.
How did he radicalize you?
What he did, first of all, I think the cloistered life itself radicalizes if you let it. It's cloistered. There's no active ministry. Getting up at 2:30 in the morning, chanting the Psalms, going to bed at 7 o'clock at night. So it's a life of silence, simplicity, and prayer, seeking God in the ordinariness of our days, and finding in the mercy of Jesus what sustains us in our own fragility. And so it's a whole way of life that's devoted to that. And so what he did was he encouraged me in my own longings and my own desire, some experiences that I was having of God, and just led me to keep leaning even deeper into it and guiding me. And then he saw in the classical texts of the mystics, John of the Cross and Teresa and Eckhart, like trustworthy guidance. They're trying to help us to discern the signs that we're being led into these more unitive states of union with God. And he said once to the novices that the cloistered monastic life is carefully designed to cultivate it. But there are people in the world that are being drawn into these unitive states, and they have no one to help them understand what's happening to them and how to cooperate with it. So when I left the monastery, I found that was true. And that's what really led me to start giving retreats and writing Merton's Palace. And it's been a calling for me,
Can you say a word, too, if you would, about what Merton was like for you as a spiritual director and talking to you personally about guiding you to God?
Well, I thought it was extraordinary. He had such a big effect on me because I was absorbed in his book through high school, and I read some of his other things. I saw him as a living mystic, and so I felt so honored to be in his presence and to be with him this way, and I trusted his guidance this way. And I'll share something that and looking back, we were together. I saw him one-on-one every other week for about 3 years. And I realized that in all of our sessions, it was under the auspices of three things happened over and over again in our sessions. 3 questions. His first question would always be, how's it going? And what he wanted me to do is be honest with him. Like, what's it like living here? Do you feel you belong here? Does it sit well with you? Like, be honest with me. He was always very practical and honest and real that way. His second question was, how's it going in your surrender to God, who accessed your heart and brought you to this place that God might transform you into himself? That was the second question.
Wow.
That was the second. He says that's what monasteries are for. That's what monasteries are for.
The surrender to God.
How to surrender to God, who accessed your heart and brought you to this place that God might transform you into himself.
So how's that part going? Wow.
Well,
and that's only the second question.
Yeah, and the third question is how's it going in discovering the depth of the second question, percolating up to the messy details of the first question, because you're just you. See, in other words, the infinite love of God is incarnate in your endless in your endless ordinariness. Thomas Merton once said, I realize the only way I'm ever going to be at peace is to accept myself as I am, because there's very little chance that I'm ever going to be anybody else. Yes. And God's not waiting for me to find some state of perfection to love me. God's infinitely in love with me just as I am. And so he always had that kind of radical, humble, tone to all of it. And I just absorbed it and walked with it and changed my life.
That's so beautiful. Well, so what is it, almost 60 years later, or here you are launching this new series of books on the mystics with Orbis Books.
Yeah.
And you're hosting this very popular podcast on the mystics. And your first volume, which is coming out pretty soon, is on Merton. I wonder if you'd just tell us a little bit about this first volume about Merton as a teacher of God and a mystic.
Yeah. What this is that when Richard asked me to be one of the core teachers of the Living School, and Kirsten Oates attended, and then they put her on the faculty. She and I got together, and we host this podcast, Turning to the Mystics. I think we just finished our 13th mystic. We just did Therese of Lisieux. And I'm going through all these mystics that affected my whole life, like speaking from my heart about the mystic and how it sheds light on the ordinariness of our lives. And so there's these audio sets people can listen to. So what Orbis is doing is taking each audio set and turning it into a hardcover, into a book. And so it's going to be a series of volumes of the Turning to the Mystics talks written as a book. And so the first volume is on Thomas Merton, which is coming out very soon now, actually. Yeah.
That's great. Congratulations. I think I read your best-selling book, Merton's Palace of Nowhere, which, as I recall, came out in the mid-'70s. When it came out, a long time ago, I don't have a copy now. I wish I did. What did you... I remember loving it as everybody did. But tell us now what you meant by that extraordinary title.
Yes. What the book's about really is, I wrote it after I left the monastery, is Thomas Merton's insight into the ancient wisdom of mystical Christianity, of our ultimate identity hidden with Christ and God before the origins of the universe. And so the spiritual life is the path that heals us, what hinders us from being more habitually established in that we subsist in God like light subsists in flame. Whereas Merton puts it, when Jesus says I and I say I, it's the same I. So the spiritual life, the contemplative way of life then, is a way of life that leads us to that unitive state. So the title itself, The Palace of Nowhere, is that Merton one of his insights was the unity of the mystical traditions of all the world's great religions. And so in the Taoist tradition in China, of Taoism, most known for Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. So the Tao is like the flowing river of divinity that courses the interiority of all things. And so how can we find our way to that and live in it? Well, another Taoist teacher is Chuang-Tzu. Merton wrote a translation.
Beautiful.
And so Chuang-Tzu says, come with me to the palace of nowhere, where all the many things are one. And so Merton, I didn't know that. So I saw that as a metaphor for the transsubjective unitive experience of the true self in God. And that's how I took that title.
That's great. There's a beautiful book, and he thought it was one of his favorites out of his 150 books, The Way of Jiao-Tzu.
It's a little short little...
Yeah.
He says, Chuang-Tzu says a couple of things. He says, one, he says, anyone can think of the absence of nothing. Anyone can think of the absence of something, but who can understand the absence of nothing? And another thing that Chuang-Tzu said, which is great, he said, imagine the river. Imagine there's a huge torrential flood for days and days and days, and the river floods the banks on both sides, floods the farmlands, the villages, and so on. So Chuang-Tzu, he personifies the river, and the river, he says, rolls his eyes and said, look at me, rolling along like this, see how powerful I am. He says, until he gets to the ocean. And when he gets to the ocean, that's the Tao. That is, he comes into the infinity that impoverishes his imagined bigness. And that's what happens when we're mystically awakened. So anyways, he's a lovely teacher.
Wow, that's so beautiful. You and I have talked about privately a lot of the saints and mystics, and we're both devotees and fans of Saint Therese of Lisieux and outside of Paris. And so I just thought it would be great if you could say, because I know she's going to be, you've just finished doing a series on her, and she's going to be one of your books. Any key points for us, for our listeners, about her life, and in particularly the little way of merciful love, which I always think of as another angle on what, Gandhi and Dr. King called nonviolence.
Yeah, her writing is a story of a soul.
Mm-hmm.
She lived in the 1800s in France, and she entered the cloistered Carmelite monastery when she was just 14 years old. And she was asked her to write the story of her spiritual life. That's how we have her teachings. And she died of tuberculosis just a few years later, a painful death. And so just to single out a few things, I think she's so stunning. She wasn't an ecstatic mystic. She like visions like Teresa of Avila, but it was almost like a mystical consciousness of Jesus' oneness with her in the ordinariness of our lives.
Yes, that's it.
And that's the key. So she talks about the little way, like to pick up a pin for Jesus. And if you do it with love, the very love of Jesus is incarnate in picking up that little pin, and that little act of love radiates and touches the whole world in ways you don't understand. That was her teaching.
It's really the same as Thich Nhat Hanh in terms of mindfulness, but she connected it to Jesus and oneness with all people.
And she's like Merton, too. Merton has a saying in The Sign of Jonas. He's lying on his bed at night. He has insomnia.
Yeah.
And he says, suddenly the bed becomes an altar. And in a distant city somewhere, someone is suddenly able to pray. He said, maybe the people whose lives we will touch the most deeply are people we won't meet till after we are dead. So there's a strong, like the mystical body that we're all woven into each other. So our hidden fidelity to love is the love that radiates out and touches the whole world. Another thing she said was an example. She said she wanted to be a saint, but she realized how weak she was. And so she turned to Jesus and she said, you're going to have to be my holiness. And I know you are, because you in Jesus gave yourself to me in my littleness. It's my very littleness that you've identified with. My very ordinariness is the divinity of you this way. And then just cite one more example. She said, how rare it is to find souls that have learned not to base their potential for union with God with their progress in overcoming obstacles and reaching holiness, but rather how rare it is that the sole basis is God's infinite love for them and their inability to get past their obstacles. Because God, the Word became flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's the divinity of the broken place itself, deeply accepted. That's Jesus. Jesus is God's response to us.
She was stunning. So far ahead of her time, and the first great saint and writer to talk about the absolute ordinariness and the spectacular presence of God, which is available in every ordinary moment, and especially in our brokenness, if we enter into the love of Christ in that moment. That's what you're trying to tell us, right?
I would put it another way. I would say that each of the saints and mystics down through the ages in his or her own way are saying that. It's in other words, it doesn't say that, and the Word became humanity and dwelt among us, but the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus is God's response to us in our dilemma, and he walks with us and he finds us in the broken places. Deeply accepted is the divinization of our hearts this way. And I think it's the holiness of, Merton used to say in the monastery, is there a Christian in the house? Raise your hand. It's the essence of the gospel. And it's, we're trying to find our way to be habitually stabilized in it and live it in the world.
So Therese is the little Teresa, and then you've studied and talked a lot about the great, famous doctor of the church, although Therese of Lisieux is now a doctor too, the great Saint Teresa of Avila from Spain, one of the greatest mystics in all religions and teachers, whoever was. And I know very little, I'm ashamed to say, of Teresa of Avila. And so could you just say a few words to me at my kindergarten level, any key lessons about the great Teresa of Avila?
Teresa of Avila lived in Spain, 16th century. And she belonged to the Carmelite order of nuns, and she helped reform the order. The Discalced Carmelites reformed the order back to a life of more poverty, simplicity, and prayer. And that's the Discalced Carmelites. And that's the order that Therese of Lisieux belonged to in France centuries later. And so Teresa of Avila, she's 16th century. And to single out one thing about her teachings, toward the end of her life, she was asked to write a book on prayer. And she wrote a book called The Interior Castle. And she said, it's a lovely book. It's in the podcast. We did it in the series. She said it came to her to think of our soul as a huge, an immense castle made of crystal or diamond. And that God is living in the innermost hidden center of our own soul. The kingdom of heaven is within you. And so God, whom the whole universe cannot contain, is inside of you. This way. And so if you think of heaven as where God lives, your soul is God's heaven this way. And she said, imagine your soul is 7 concentric circles going out. So the 7th innermost circle is where God is waiting in the center of your soul, in and beyond yourself. And each circle going out is an increasing degree of surrendered transformation in Jesus. And so she says, some people don't even know they have a soul. They're so caught up in the externals of life. She said, but things happen, love found, love lost, and you kind of serendipitously stumble into the interiority of your own soul. And so the first mansion is where you first get your bearings. And each mansion is then you go a little deeper, transformed in love. And the first 3 mansions are really psychological, spiritual maturity. This way. The 4th mansion is where she starts, where the mystical life starts. I'll give one example. And she's writing this to help us recognize that maybe we're having this experience, but it's so subtle we don't recognize the implications of it. She said, imagine you're sitting there in spiritual reading, you have the scriptures are open. And she said, you get the feeling that you're praying to God somewhere far off, like our Father who art in heaven. And also it takes effort because you're dealing with distractions and so on. And she said, as you're sitting there this way in devotional sincerity, she's all of a sudden, there's a sudden shift in your awareness. And you get the feeling that God's not somewhere far off, but God's flowing into you from some hidden place down in the hidden depths of yourself. And God's flowing into you without effort, like a quiet flow of divinity into the depths of yourself. Very subtle, very, very subtle. And she says, imagine a basin filling with water. And she's comparing God's presence to water. And the basin fills up till it overflows. But what if there was a basin that instead of overflowing, the basin kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger? And you realize that's what's happening to your heart. As you're sitting there in your ordinariness, your own heart is being enlarged to the boundaryless proportions of the infinite love flowing into it. And you surrender to that it might have its way with you. That's how she talks.
Wow.
So, yeah.
It's just really great.
Yeah.
Jim, the way I've listened to you over the years and read you talk about Merton and all these great saints and the history of mysticism and contemplation and so forth, everything for you, like nobody else I know, is you're trying to talk about God and lead us to God. So this is an outrageous question, but here goes. What do you want us to know about God? I'm a name dropper, as you know. Tell me about God, Jim.
Here's the way I would put it. When we like read the scriptures in a contemplative, prayerful way about God, beginning first with the mystery of creation. In the first words of the Torah, in the beginning, God said, let there be light, let there be stones and trees and stars, and so on. Then let there be the human person. Let us make the human person in our image and likeness. So here, this is God. I would put it this way, that ultimately speaking, just one thing is happening. The infinite presence of God is presencing itself. It's pouring itself out and giving itself away, whole and complete, in and as the intimate immediacy of our very presence, the presence of others and all things, and our nothingness without God. That's God. That if we think of God, quoting Meister Eckhart, we think of God as generosity, that the generosity of the infinite is infinite, and we are the generosity of God. We're the song that God sings, and this is who we are as persons. This is the person that we are. Then God takes that as a capacity and makes it real by giving it a nature. It's a capacity, but it needs to be actualized by living it. So the mythic story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they were like God. Their nature, the human nature is reason, science, and all of that. But originally, the greatest thing about human nature is the capacity to realize the person that we are, that their nature was aglow with divinity. And next, he gave them the gift of freedom, because love is never imposed, it's always offered. God wants us to freely say yes and give ourselves to God. It is freely given to us as our very self. The mystery of the fall is trying to be like God without God. And we're caught in that.
Yeah.
Because we're caught in the traumatized capacity to be surrendered over to the divinity of ourselves. And then Jesus is God's response to that. In Jesus, God descends and goes as low as it needs to go to find and meet and walk with us as invincibly precious in the ways that we lose our way in our own life. And that's the gospel. That's the good news of Jesus Christ.
Wow. I've heard you use the word surrender several times today so far. And I sent you, I don't know if you have it, my new book, Universal Love, Surrendering to the God of Peace. You won't remember this, but I told you that I've been journeying on that these last years into total surrender, not my will, your will be done, as the heart of the gospel and the spiritual life. Can you say a word specifically, because I'm so interested in it, about it's all about free will and complete surrender to God. And I, as not that bright, I thought all my life, well, hey, I'm surrendered to God. And now I find out that like maybe 1%. I'm still trying to run the show. Can you say a little bit about surrendering ourselves to God completely? That's what Merton told you. That's what Thérèse of Lisieux and Teresa of Avila talk about. And you.
Well, this is my sense. I'll put in the imagery of the gospel, or Jesus often taught this in parables or stories. So the parable we all know is the parable of the prodigal son.
Right.
And he's trying to say this is what God's like. So there's this very person of great wealth and power, 2 sons, and one, much to the father's sadness, wants his inheritance, and he goes off and squanders it, loses all of it in a kind of tragic way. So the son lost so much. He lost the inheritance. He certainly lost a sense of himself, the shame. And so he comes sheepishly back home, and he's kind of memorizing what he's going to tell. He knows it's too much to let his father accept him back again as his son. But just maybe his father would let him maybe live in a little tent behind the garage or something. And he's coming back. And here all along, Jesus says, every day the father's been waiting for him on the road. And when he sees his son coming, he doesn't even wait for the son to get to the door. He always tells the servants to start a great feast. And he rushes out on the road, puts a ring on his son's finger and hugs him. The son is trying to speak out his apologies, and the father doesn't even need to hear it. See? Because all of your failings are irrelevant. And the question is this: he lost so much, but did he lose so much that he lost his father's love for him? And we can never lose God's love for us, ever. And that's what God's like. And so this idea that a complete surrender, God is in Jesus is God's complete surrender to us. And we're not capable of a complete surrender.
Yeah.
We don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
But what we do is we completely surrender ourselves over to God, who is completely surrendered over to us and our inability to know what it means. And that's Thomas Merton once said, in the ways of God, to understand is to realize that you're infinitely understood.
Yes.
And to accept is that you're infinitely accepted. So we have to, by this acceptance of our inability to completely accept, and the deep acceptance of the very inability is God's infinite acceptance of us as the beloved in our poverty, which is experiential salvation. It's the gift of tears. It's the gift,
Wow, thank you. So when you first did your Zoom for me at the Beatitude Center, I asked you to speak about the connection between mysticism and nonviolence, as Gandhi and Dr. King talked about it, and you gave a beautiful talk. And for folks who are interested, it's not only on YouTube, but I typed it out and edited it as part of, I was asked by our mutual friend Richard Rohr to help curate and co-edit this edition of a theological journal that Richard publishes called Oneing. And he has a one-word title for each special edition. And this one was called Nonviolence. And I put in my conversations with Jim Lawson and John Lewis, and I got an article from Joan Baez and a poem by Dan Bergen, all my friends. And we end with your reflections on the connection and the depths of mystical nonviolence. So here we are as we're recording this. The United States is obliterating Iran and killing many, many people, and killing people with Israel as well in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon, many other places. And we're supporting the killings in Ukraine and Congo and South Sudan. And there's so much injustice and growing fascism, racism and oligarchy and the threat of nuclear war and environmental destruction. So I want to ask the question again. If you would talk a little bit about this mystery of God that you've been telling us, who loves us infinitely beyond our understanding, and the God of nonviolence, or the connection with this way of nonviolence that Gandhi and King said was at the heart of understanding Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yes. This is one way to approach it, I guess, is to start looking at it. The world's always been like this. It's true that certain countries and certain times are fortunate enough to have peace. And the peace crumbles and falls and it rises up again, and all this. Because when Jesus was living, the Jewish people were under the rule of Rome. And they were under the dominance of Rome. And so Marcus Borg, Jesus again for the first time, the biblical scholar, he wrote a book on the last week of Jesus' life as the biblical scholar.
Right.
The Last Supper at Garden of Gethsemane and so on. By the way, at the Last Supper, there was a traitor at the table. Things weren't off to a good start.
Right.
There's already a troubled situation this way. And he gave this image. He said Pontius Pilate was coming from Rome to be procurator and coming into Jerusalem to rule over the Jewish people with soldiers with swords and spears and marching in. Coming in on the other side of Jerusalem was Jesus riding on a donkey, and people were waving palms. Hey, Zana, hey, Zana, 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 hey. So he says, so which parade do we belong to this way? And so the whole mystery of the cross, the sovereignty of love. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. The image that really strikes me this way, it says that when Jesus died, they pierced his heart with a lance, and blood and water flowed out like the birth of a child. And then there was no more Jesus left in Jesus. And then the only Jesus that was ever really there is manifested throughout the whole world this way. So Jesus says, come follow me. This way. Is it possible that I could learn to die of love at the hands of love until nothing's left of me but love? And nothing is left of me but love in the midst of, I was also a clinical psychologist. I worked with trauma for 30 years. And I also have my own trauma work. But sometimes the AA is like this too. Sometimes in the midst of walking through your own trauma, right in the midst of unresolved things, you can experience your being unexplainably sustained as precious in the midst of the vulnerability of your heart. So I think the first step for all of us is to become that ourselves with God's grace. How? Because we are the world. Thomas Merton says, God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten Son. The world is us. That each one of us is empire and microcosm. And each one of us is infinitely loved by God in our brokenness. So in our own perpetual surrender, our own repentance, our own mercy, our own gratitude, can we learn to be someone in whose presence others are able to see you? So Jesus said, I'll end with this insight too. He said, be wise as a serpent and simple as a dove. That is, he was nobody's fool. He was not naive about the ways. Look what happened to him. See? Be wise as a serpent, but don't be so serpent-like and wise about the evils of the world that you lose the simplicity of a dove, because the simplicity of a love utterly transcends and permeates the brokenness. Even if you're hanging on the cross, it transcends it. It's the inner peace that isn't dependent on the outcome of our efforts,
Right.
because it's the peace of God on which everything depends. Merton once said, those committed to social justice must be very careful never to get overly invested in the outcome of their efforts, because by human standards, it may go down in flames. That's the cross. And so the light of the resurrection, another image.
Say that in light of the resurrection. What?
Because in the light of the resurrection, the deathless love of God utterly transcends and utterly permeates the brokenness itself. Mm-hmm. That Judas and Peter both committed the same sin. They both betrayed Christ. Judas was so crushed by what he did, he takes his own life. Peter went out and wept. And Jesus makes him head of the church because he wept. That the holiness of the church is the brokenness of the heart, of a love that God's infinitely in love with us in our brokenness itself. And so I think I know this is personal. I say this as a therapist, a spiritual direction, how each one of us walks this walk, with God's grace to be God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten Son, and that world is the world in which all this is happening this way, and always will be happening until the end. It's always like this, I think.
Jim, it's been so beautiful listening to you, and we're really out of time. So let me just ask, is there any last thing you'd like to share with us, with the listeners, or particularly as a word of encouragement in this time to keep going forward in their search of God or opening to God?
I would just end by the last question you had on your list. What sustains me?
Yeah, I didn't get into asking you that.
I'll end with that. I'll
Okay.
use that to sustain me. To say, here's where I'm at with it. I'm 82 years old, and I live here at the edge of the ocean where Maureen and I lived for 30 years. She died of Alzheimer's right here in the living room 4 years ago. And I sit out here, and I'm sustained by God in my fragility and in my brokenness. It's like the amazement of God's presence in our lives, and that's what sustains me. And I would end with that, and so.
Thank
Praise
you.
the Lord. Yeah, sure.
Amen, brother. Well, Jim, it's always beautiful listening to you, and I hope everyone listening will check out his books and his podcast. So thank you so much, Jim Finley, for speaking with me today. And thank you, friends, for listening to this episode of the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. You can hear many other podcasts and find other upcoming Zoom programs at www.beatitudecenter.org. And there you can also sign up to receive our free e-blast, which has news about upcoming guests on the podcasts and Zooms. And you can help me, please, by telling your friends and coworkers about this podcast and encouraging them to listen in. And a shameless plug, I have a new book out, which I hope you might consider getting. It's called Universal Love, Surrendering to the God of Peace. So thanks, everyone, for being here. May the God of peace bless you all. Keep on following the Nonviolent Jesus, and see you next time.